Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to bring you the first part of my May reading wrap-up because it's been a while since I've rounded up all the books I've been reading recently, so I will be coming at you in a couple of days with part 2, but in the meantime, let's dive into this first batch of books. I want to start with The New Me by Halle Butler, which I discussed in my last video in the context of recent millennial fiction, so I encourage you to go check that out. But briefly, this is a very short novel that follows 30-year-old millennial Millie, who is living in Chicago and trying and failing to secure permanent long-term employment. And her inability to hold on to a temp job is a glaring symptom of the broader dysfunction of her life. In addition to her stagnant professional circumstances, Millie can't get it together enough to practice basic hygiene. Her apartment is a festering pit of garbage and empty bottles, and her feelings of deep bitterness and resentment and occasional violent outbursts have poisoned almost all of her interpersonal relationships as well. So Millie is really having a tough time of it, but she's also this immensely frustrating character because of all of the ways in which she's been set up to succeed. She's college educated, she doesn't have student loans to pay off, and she's coddled by parents who subsidize the rent on her downtown apartment, among other things. So with all of that in mind, Millie's lack of personal accountability is really quite galling, and even more frustrating are her half-hearted attempts at self-improvement, which usually involve taking out the trash or signing up for gym memberships that she never really uses. But it's to Butler's credit that her characterization of Millie manages to be both damning and empathetic, because I think there are elements of Millie's unraveling that are clearly rooted in some sort of deep depression and in feelings of self-loathing and loneliness and entitlement that I think may not be unfamiliar for a lot of readers. So I don't think this book is a must-read by any stretch, and there were times when the reading experience itself was quite exasperating and deeply unpleasant, almost like poking at a raw wound with a dirty finger over and over again. But I think it does raise some interesting questions about millennial burnout and millennial entitlement, about the false promise of society's self-improvement narrative, and more broadly about the kind of banal realities of day-to-day adult life. But like I said, if you want to hear more about all of that, I encourage you to check out my full discussion video, which I'll link down below. Next up, I have Where Reasons End by Yiyun, which is a novel that follows a series of conversations between a writer and her teenage son Nikolai, who has recently committed suicide. And although this is a work of fiction, I think it's worth noting that Yiyun published this book after losing her own oldest child to suicide as well. And I recently read Lee's memoir, Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in Your Life, in which she uses writing and language and passages from some of her favorite books as a lens through which to explore her own experiences of depression and suicidal ideation. And she takes a kind of similar approach in this book, using the process of writing and words in particular as a means of trying to cope with and understand the immensity of this kind of grief. Because the conversations that this writer is having with her son in this book are ultimately entirely of her own making, existing kind of out of space and time and made up of nothing more than the framework of words. And this narrator digs into the roots and the meanings of various words, trying to find a language for her grief, and all the while her son, like so many petulant teens, kind of berates her for leaning on cliches and using too many lazy metaphors. And so this is not a conventional book about grief by any stretch. It's much more heady and drifting in its questions and ideas, and it's not particularly focused on character or on catharsis. And so in that way, it's not really the tearjerker that you might expect. But what I find so remarkable about Lee's books are the extent to which they are uncompromising and not willing to be easy reads. They are often not gratifying, their meanings are rarely self-evident, and they often involve her following a particular question to rope's end. As you read, it's only natural to want to kind of arrive at a solid sort of answer or reason to all of this grief, but what you get instead is a sense of trying to wrap your fingers around a shadow or around the abyss, which doesn't make for the most cathartic or comforting or satisfying reading experience, but I think that it's much more truthful. And no one puts it better than Lee herself when she says, "Words fall short, yes, but sometimes their shadows can reach the unspeakable." And so despite its lack of tidy answers, this book has a great deal of emotional and intellectual depth to it, and also a great deal of probing humility, which I found incredibly moving. And so for those reasons, I think this book is well worth grappling with. It also got me thinking about other books about grief and writers writing through grief, and so I'm working on a longer discussion video about those kinds of books, which you can keep an eye out for in the next couple of weeks. Thinking about all of these themes also prompted me to pick up Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter, which I've been hearing incredible things about on BookTube and elsewhere for the past few years. And this book is an experimental novella that weaves elements of poetry and fable into its central story about a recently widowed father and his two young boys. And in the midst of their tremendous loss, this small family is visited by Crow, who is an at-turns antagonistic and at-turns soothing figure that, depending on how you interpret it, could be read as a manifestation of their unbearable grief. The father in this story is a Ted Hughes scholar, and it is my understanding that the central conceit of the Crow in this book is borrowed from Ted Hughes' famous poetry collection, Crow, although I don't think it's necessary to have read that book for the symbolism in this one to be legible. And fittingly, there is a beautiful poetry to this book that really requires you to slow down and consider the words and their rhythms on each and every page. But there are also certain passages from the Crow's perspective that are at turns loud and disruptive and cacophonous, and those interludes didn't always quite translate off the page for me. Perhaps they would have if I had had this book read to me. The other thing that prevented me from really loving this book the way that other people seem to really love it was the fact that despite the incredibly beautiful language and the very striking imagery of the Crow, the actual insights about grief and loss in this book did not feel quite as profound to me as the way in which Max Porter expressed them. For example, at one point the boys describe themselves this way: "We are 50 feet out to sea, being chewed apart by sadness." In another passage, the father says, "My body is not bird-like. Again, the wings, the love. Bird-like, again, I beg everything again." And so the language in this book is often quite stunning and lovely, but a lot of the sentiments in this book concern the tremendous sadness of grief, the ache of absence, the fear of forgetting your loved one who is passed. And for me, those things, however true, weren't quite as surprising or revelatory as I was expecting, and it didn't quite deepen or change my ideas about grief in the way that a book like Where Reasons End did. So it didn't fully work for me, but I think a lot of that comes down to subjectivity and not to any particular failure on Max Porter's part. Moving on to something a little bit lighter, this weekend I read The Right Swipe by Alisha, which is the first novel in her new modern love romance series. And I first saw this book on the writer Ashley C. Ford's Instagram stories, I believe, and it was raining all day Saturday, and I was looking for something just cute and cozy to curl up with, and this book definitely did the trick. And this novel follows Rhiannon Hunter, who is the founder of a Bumble-esque dating app called Crush, and former NFL linebacker Samson Lima, who she matches with on Crush before discovering that he is the new spokesperson for rival online dating service Matchmaker, which is more in the vein of Match.com or eHarmony. A few things that made this book stand out in the vast ocean of romance novels. One, both leads had fairly well-developed backstories and personal subplots. I think romance has been getting more and more feminist in recent years in that there seems to be a greater emphasis on having female heroines who have very rich and developed personal and professional lives, besides the central romance, but I thought that Samson's story in this book was just as, if not more, compelling than Rhiannon's, and it kind of dealt with some football CTE stuff that I thought was pretty interesting. Secondly, the secondary characters and friendships in this book felt really vibrant and touching and richly filled in, and gave this book a really lived-in feel. And I think that Rai is setting herself up well to continue this series with perhaps one of those characters. And third, there was only one instance of truly unbelievable miscommunication between the leads, which is less than you would expect from your average romance novel. That is probably my biggest pet peeve about the genre in general, but it's also fairly unavoidable, so to only encounter it once in this book was fantastic. There is some stuff involving like a truly villainous ex that I could have done without, and some of the ways that this book portrayed marketing and publicity was deeply suspect, but that's okay. Other than that, it was just a really cute, quick, satisfying read, probably 5 peppers or whatever in terms of heat. And it also seems like it's probably going to be marketed in the vein of Jasmine Guillory's books or Helen Huang's books, although I did like this a lot better than The Wedding Date. But if that type of thing interests you, then I recommend checking this book out. It's out on July 1st from Avon. And then I wanted to wrap things up by talking about Milkman by Anna Burns. And a couple of months ago, I mentioned that I was having a fairly lackluster reading year so far, and that I had yet to come across a book or a novel in particular that just really blew me away. But I'm here to say the drought is over. Milkman is definitely that book. I'm planning to do a full review for this book, so I want to keep my thoughts here fairly brief, but I will just say, like, wow, I loved this book and I was not expecting to. All through the Man Booker stuff last fall and this year with the Women's Prize, I just was not super interested in the premise of this book, which follows an 18-year-old narrator living in 1970s Belfast at the height of the Troubles. And I had also heard a lot of the discussion around the difficulty and the denseness of this book, which kind of put me off it, but I had heard a lot of people recommend the audiobook, and so I gave that a try and was really surprised by how much I loved and was kind of pulled in by the narration and the flow of the book. And then I got about a third of the way into it, and there's a particular section that kind of explains the cover of this book, and it was just like rapturous. And that was when I was like, I need to go out and get a hard copy of this book, because I just wanted to be able to see the words on the page and kind of immerse myself in the language and the rhythm and the flow of it all. And so I did. I got a physical copy, and then I started the book again from the beginning, and I'm so glad I did, because I just loved every moment of reading this book. I will say I'm glad I listened to some of the audiobook for this, because Brid Brennan's narration is just spectacular, and I think gave me a sense of the rhythm and the sound of all of these characters. But yeah, I didn't find this to be a particularly difficult reading experience. There is a certain quality of repetition and Northern Irish colloquialisms and kind of not quite grammatically correct phrasing that does kind of make this narration kind of different or unfamiliar, but it kind of reminded me of when you're reading a Victorian novel when you haven't for a while, and it just takes you a little bit of time to get into the flow of it all and into the sound of it. And then once you've adapted to that, it just starts to feel like the most natural thing in the world. So yeah, that's all I want to say about it for now. I'll have a full review coming in the next few weeks, but in the meantime, I really encourage everyone to check this one out. I don't think it's for everyone, but if it's for you, I think you'll just love it, hopefully as much as I did. That's all I have for now. I'll be back in a couple of days with the second part of my May reading wrap up. If you've read any of these books and have thoughts on them, let me know in the comments below, or let me know what your best read of the year so far has been. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!